Welcome to devMode.fm, a podcast dedicated to the tools, techniques, and technologies used in modern web development. I'm Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107.
I'm Marion Nullifant here in Portland, Oregon.
I'm Matt Stein from Working Concept in Seattle.
And today we have on Simon Cox from Cox Co Creative. Simon, how you doing?
Well, hello. I'm doing very well, thank you.
Awesome. And we're here to talk about SEO for web developers, right? So SEO is something that no matter who you are as a web developer, you have kind of run into this. And I'm curious what your take on this is, Simon. So if you were at mile 61 in the Frozen Head State Park in Tennessee running the Barkley Marathon, and someone ran up to you and said, "Hey, what is SEO anyway?" What would you tell them?
First thing would be like, where am I? What am I doing here? SEO is, to me, there's several different versions of SEO. There's the technical SEO, which is where I'm embedded, which is making websites work better. And then there's the non-technical SEO, which is more about link building, affiliates, and stuff like that, which is, to be honest, I'm not so much interested in that. And that's probably where some of the bad reputation comes from.
Well, which is the one where we start sacrificing chickens and drawing pentagrams on the floor? And which is the sphere that happens in?
That happens in the affiliate stuff and the link building, etc. And that's where you've got the agencies out there who are, let's say, not selling snake oil.
Matt, you were going to say something?
Second one, definitely.
The second one is where it happens. Yeah, I mean, it's weird, right? So, I mean, I have done speeches on SEO, wrote an SEO plugin and worked a ton with it. And I still have a very icky feeling when I talk about it or the industry, you know? And an analogy that I have made, and I think it's probably pretty reasonable, is that it's kind of like the diet industry. Right? In that it's not that there are not very good nutritionists out there, very good personal trainers, et cetera, et cetera. It's just that 90% of it is garbage in terms of like diet pills, you know, take this and you'll instantly be slim and all that kind of stuff. And it feels like SEO is trying to appeal to the same thing. Everyone wants to be thin and pretty. Everyone wants to rank first in Google, right? I mean, does that sound reasonable, Simon?
Yeah, it does. It's marketing at its worst side. I would say that really isn't so much SEO. SEO is one of the factors in that people use. And they've used it for the last, 10 years as a get-rich-quick option. It's like a gold rush because the tools became available and the search engines, you could cheat them. And that's all changed in the last couple of years.
You can't do that anymore.
Not so easy. So there are people still around doing it. There are still techniques to do it. Apparently, I don't know them.
Right.
But I come across them occasionally, and it's disappearing and it's dying. The SEO industry is growing up. But on the technical side, I think that side of it's always been there. But that's actually growing and getting stronger and stronger because it's becoming a niche of its own. And I think it's becoming more and more important as everything gets more complex.
Would it be overly bold to say that modern SEO is technical SEO?
It's a big part of it, yes, but I wouldn't go as far as that. I would think technical SEO is becoming its own thing. And the rest of it, which is, I don't hear the term SEM much these days, search engine marketing. People kind of roll that in with SEO and do the whole thing. It's like...
But it's a totally different thing, though.
It is, but it's like 20 years ago, you talked about digital. It was the web.
Right.
Digital marketing, web. Who calls themselves digital marketing these days? I mean,
well, listen, I know some teams at agencies that are still called like the digital team, you know?
Well, maybe they do a lot of print production still, but I bet parts of that print production are very digital these days. You don't need the word digital anymore.
Right.
And it's the same thing with SEO. I think it's going off into its niches and expanding that way.
Well, here's the thing that I've run into. And then if you're a web developer, whether you're at an agency or you're a freelancer or whatever, this has invariably happened that you are working for a company that has hired on an SEO consultant, right? And you'll get all sorts of just random crazy requests to do things that, you know, I look at them through the lens of someone who has spent a whole lot of time learning about what matters and what doesn't matter in SEO. And I see some of these requests and they can't be anything other than either superstition or busy work. Things that the SEO company wants you to do just so that they can bill. Have you run into that at all, Simon? I mean, I run into it all the time.
Yeah, it happens a lot. And the main reason that is because it's an industry which has not bedded itself down yet. And that's mainly because the biggest player in it, Google, has not bedded itself down. It's just changing, and it's changing more often now than ever before. So while 2 years ago we had an algorithm change every 6 months and everybody got really worried about it, we're getting 6 a day now instead. And it is just constant change. In a way that...
Okay, but here's the thing, though. Here's a question for you, though. So if it is constant change, does it make sense that what we could do is focus on the fundamentals, like have good content?
Yeah. And that's one of my tenets, always go to keep it as simple as possible. If you overcomplicate it, things are going to change. And there were ways of gaming the system, but tomorrow it might fall flat on its face. So 5 years ago, you may have got a couple of years out of it. So they're changing it on a constant basis to stop people trying to game the system. So rather than building, to me, there's so as I mentioned, there's two types of site. There's the sites where people go and build content because they've got a product or a message or something. So that's your company websites or your blog, etc. You're building a website to deliver information to people. And then you've got other people who are building websites to sell advertising. And what they want to do is build a loads of pages to get people clicking through them, so to get themselves high up in the rankings so that people click through and they get ad revenue from that. That's no good for anyone, because that's not really giving anybody any information. It's not building a brand or rapport with the users.
Well, and there's a big irony layered on top of that too, which is that then either these companies or other companies then employ clickbots that go out and inflate the numbers. So you've created all of this stuff. You've not actually, as you mentioned, created anything. No. But you're making money.
Yes, and so is Google.
Right.
Because they're selling advertising.
Right.
That's changing slowly, insane. But it is insane. It's changing slowly, though. And I think Google's been slow about it because it is big revenue for them. But they're killing these things off slowly. But good content is the basis of it. And delivering that content in a way that's well-structured, etc., is good for people.
Well, here's an example. And I'm not going to name names, but I've got a huge list of companies I've worked with that have had SEO agencies on to do this, that, or the other thing. And, when I see they're billing, $2,000 a month, and what the SEO company is doing is they're going in there and they're just tweaking keywords and descriptions. Like that's what they're doing, right? I look at that and it blows my mind because, as you said, they can increase something for today's algorithm, but maybe tomorrow it's going to be worse, right?
Yep.
Whereas if they took that $2,000 and they invested it in creating better content or improving their website, improving the accessibility, improving any number of other aspects of it, they'd be well ahead of the game,
Absolutely. And a good agency will go in and talk about the bottom line if it's a company that's driving revenue, and they need to increase that bottom line. It doesn't matter about getting number one rankings, etc. You need more visitors, but you don't want just more visitors. You want ones that will go through and complete a transaction, etc.
Right.
So you want the right visitors. You've got to have the right content to bring somebody in who will go through that sales funnel and buy that thing at the end. You don't just want a shed load of visitors and notice your bounce rate goes through the roof because they're going and finding the site. Brilliant. They're just bouncing away and not doing anything.
Yeah.
Did you just say a shed load? Like a shed?
I did. That's a small wooden box where you can get lots of stuff in.
we use a different term here.
Yeah, it sounds similar, but
it's
more crude.
Yeah. But okay, so, bringing it back to what you were talking about, I mean, I see it all the time where there are SEO firms that they are hired just to do things that really look like busy work to me, right? And it drives me nuts. It really drives me nuts because I think about that from the perspective of what kind of qualitative and really useful improvements could be made to the website if that budget were diverted elsewhere. That's the part that drives me crazy.
I totally agree with that. At the same time, I see the opposite where businesses don't want to spend the money at all. They think SEO is going to cost 50 quid. $50, and then expect ranking number one from that and having tons of traffic.
Well, that's one of my rules though. If I see a website hawking SEO stuff or a product hawking SEO stuff, and it says anything about appearing like on the first page of Google or whatever, I instantly just ignore it because I know it's bullshit, you know?
Yeah.
That's just not how it works.
I get SEO emails through every day through certain contact forms for clients, and they just get spammed to death. And I read this stuff, and it's just hilarious what people are promising.
Right.
And they're obviously doing it just to do this, money for work. You look like busy. What did you call it? Busy time?
Busy work.
Busy work. Yes, there's plenty of tools out there now that you can run for free, and they'll just run that on a site, give it to the business person, and say, "Here, look, we found these issues." But that's because the business world doesn't really understand SEO, and that's
right.
Partially that's us SEOs to go out and inform people and show them how.
Well, some people don't want them to understand it. You know what I mean? Yeah, they're like, let's keep this cash cow here, because that's what you just described is exactly what a lot of these SEO firms do. And understand, like, if you're from an SEO firm and you're listening to this and you do actual legitimate work, that's fine. I'm not talking about you, but I'm talking about this large number of SEO firms that I've run into that what they do is they have a Moz account or they have a SEMrush account. They sign people up that pay them a bunch of money every month. And all they do is use those tools to run a report. And then they take that report and they send it to the client verbatim, usually. And then the client sends it to the developers and says, do this. And what's the point? What value are they adding? Well,
that's the business person to throw away money. And really that business person should be saying, well, thank you for the report, but where are the action points in this? And why? What are they and why?
Yep.
So having the report is just data, but actually then analyzing that and giving a set of action points and prioritizing them, most of these firms cannot do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we need to educate the business.
But they can't, Simon, but here's the thing. The clients, they're scared because they want to rank. Like we should be doing what this SEO company says because we want to appear on the front page of Google.
I think that way of approaching the relationship is backwards. I think the SEO company needs to understand what the business goals are, and the outcome, the reports and the tweaking and everything can look very similar, but they need to be supporting business goals and not just rearranging, the deck furniture and collecting a check. I don't know. I think there's value in keeping up with business goals and trying to hit them and work toward them, but not in just, selling services and kicking some keywords around and sharing a report.
I 100% agree.
I'm reminded of the people who call me up out of the blue and say, we noticed there's something wrong with your computer. Give us your credit card number and we'll fix it.
Well, those are outright scammers, Mary.
Well, I know that.
Oh, I see. That's the implication.
But yes.
Oh.
Well, there's a continuum between the outright scammers and the shady operators and the people who don't do so much for you and the good guys. But it sounds like it runs all the way down to the outright scammers.
And here's the thing. And I know I got Matt from Vector Media Group, now Happy Cog. I know I got him angry because I said, I was kind of maligning SEO companies. And there are definitely SEO companies that do legitimate work, but it would drive me crazy if I was one of those, like Simon, like you. And a big chunk of people in my industry were giving my industry a bad name,
Oh, yeah.
What does that piss you off, Simon?
Not really.
No?
Simply because I just don't take any notice of what goes on in those people. The industry that I know and the industry that I talk to on a daily basis on Twitter are like me. They're people doing a really good job.
Right.
Most of the clients I get are through word of mouth or not out there advertising. And because they're coming to me through word of mouth, I've already built that reputation up. And then when they first talk to me, I start a rapport off with them. So they understand how they're going to work with me, what they're going to get out of it, why it's going to cost them so much, why I'm so good, etc. And it's building that rapport up with the business that you need to do. And you need to really get underneath the skin and understand what they're doing and how they're trying to do it. Possibly even more so than if you're doing dev work.
Well, this gets back to what you were saying before about a lot of times the businesses just don't know about SEO. And that's how a lot of these other firms are able to just latch onto them and get a paycheck for doing busy work. which is unfortunate. But I don't want to spend the whole podcast griping about the industry and all that kind of stuff. But I do think that it's an important thing to talk about, because from a developer perspective, I think a lot of us we're pretty skeptical, about some of the things that we're asked to do. And we've run into this quite a bit, where they'll be like, okay, go do this. And so perfect example, someone was talking about they wanted an entry to appear both at the homepage and then also at /home, right? They wanted the same thing to appear there. And I was just like, well, why? You're going to run into duplicate content issues. Like you don't want to do that, right? I mean, yeah, you can use rel canonical and all that stuff, but why? Why did your SEO company ask you to do this? Seems strange. And he came back and said, oh, well, they're asking me to do this because they want to do an A/B test. Right. And that's another pet peeve of mine, because if you're actually going to do an A/B test, you don't want to have a different URL, one for the A and a different for the B. Like you don't want that, because Google is going to index that stuff. Like that's not how you should be doing it. But it's another pet peeve of mine, because a lot of people are doing A/B tests as a shortcut to actually doing research and designing something. Proper A/B testing requires coming up with a good hypothesis, and that good hypothesis requires research. You can't just like A/B test a button here and a button there and have the crowd decide which it should be. And the reason is there are a lot of other factors that go into it, and you're not coming at it with an actual hypothesis that means anything, But this is the kind of thing that just drives me nuts. And you don't run into this, Simon?
There's an opportunity here for devs to, when they interact with SEOs and companies, is start vetting them. And before, if you've got a relationship with a business or your internal team, make sure you're vetting who that SEO is and not what they're suggesting is right, but also vet them before they get to that stage.
Yes. And when you're in that position, when you have the ear and the trust of people that make the decisions, then that's great, because you actually have the opportunity to do that. But I've also seen it a number of cases where an agency or a freelancer, they're just a hired gun. And in fact, the chain is not where you get to help the business make the decisions. It's more that the stuff you're supposed to do is coming from the SEO people. You know what I mean? Like you're at the bottom rung. And the company's like, okay, our SEO company said do this. And you're like, okay, you're wasting your money, but I'll do it.
That's bad management, though, isn't it? Because if you're not letting the SEO team talk to the dev team, you're in a big sticky situation anyway.
Yep. No, I agree. I agree.
If you're also not listening to somebody that says this doesn't seem to make sense, then what are you doing anyway? I don't know. That's bad management.
And it may seem crazy, because exactly what both of you are saying. Like, if you're going to hire me for my technical expertise, why would you not listen to me? But I see this a lot. Like I really do. And I try to avoid those situations where if it appears that the client is not going to take my advice on certain things, I'm just like, okay, maybe we shouldn't work together,
Oh, I like it when the client doesn't take my advice. I just don't like it when they disregard whatever I'm saying. Like if we engage and it turns out I'm wrong, I'm happy with that situation. I'd rather be right, because that's much more satisfying. But
sure,
if we're engaging, to me, that's good. And that's healthy, because that's what it should be. I think bad SEO is usually just the result of bad management and not thinking through things. And I don't know, just gaps in knowledge and other things that have nothing to do with SEO. But,
right. Because the power hierarchy is wrong. Right.
Yeah.
If the developer is essentially just a short order cook for the SEO firm, then the hierarchy is wrong. It just isn't how things should be working. What do you think about that, Simon?
I totally agree with that. The SEO teams should be really working hand in hand with the developer teams, because we need to understand resource issues. Now, when I go and audit a site, I'm looking at things and saying, well, why wasn't this done that way and why wasn't that done? It's quite often there's reasons behind it, because there's a CMS that can't do something and they haven't got the resource to change it, or et cetera, et cetera. So you really do need to understand what the resource constraints are for the developers. You can't do that unless you go and talk to them. So that's a pretty, it's gonna, if I went in as an SEO and said, you need to do this, this and this without asking them why it's done that way, I'm going to upset the developers and they're not going to like it. And that's the last thing I need. But you're right, agencies will go in and say, and they're the business is paying them, and they'll just bang a report out and say, this is what you need to do.
Right.
Simon, it sounds like your encounter with clients is usually, it's not their first time talking about or thinking about SEO, but obviously they've had some exposure or something that led them to you. What's an ideal project or kind of a normal setup process look like for you?
Well, yes, I get to say it at last. It depends. My answer to everything in SEO is it depends, and it really does. A lot of the clients that come to me actually are first timers, especially small local business stuff we do. But then I have other people. I work with quite a few devs that come and get me. They understand it. They just want me to put my bits and pieces on that. So the workflow depends really on what's going on. So in Cox Co Creative, we actually build websites as well, but they're small things, hand built. I build them, which is why I'm quite good at technical SEO, because I can actually develop as well. I think that's very, very important. So that workflow depends completely on what the situation is. And other times I'm literally going in and just do consultancy work and just looking at stuff and making suggestions.
Well, I want to, if we can, talk about something that I've seen or talk about misconceptions that I think developers have about a few things. So one of them is a sitemap, right? So any SEO tool that's worth anything probably lets you generate a sitemap. And there seems to be this kind of, this kind of panic, right? That if you have so let's say we've got a site and it's been up for a year, and for some reason the sitemap is down. It's just gone. It's not working. A lot of developers or a lot of people that I've run into think that, oh my God, this means that the site, those pages don't exist anymore, right? Is that how it works, Simon?
No, not at all. You don't need a sitemap. Google will find all the pages.
Right.
But putting a sitemap and an up-to-date one in there will help Google find those pages quicker, because it just go there and find them. And if you change something, it'll go, oh, something's changed. I'll go and crawl those new pages or those updated pages. So it's really an aid to help them, but you don't actually need it. What if you've got a wrong one in there, a wrong sitemap? And I had one today, actually. Somebody rang me up and wanted me to look at a client of hers, and they'd shifted brand completely, brand new domain name. Their sitemap is all the old domain. Well, okay, that is an issue. It really ought to change over, but it's not going to do them much harm, apart from they've got two sites which are live with the same stuff.
Well, that's going to be more of a problem than anything else, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's just one of the things we need to sweep up. So yes, and it depends. That may be the only thing that's wrong with the site, in which case, yeah, that's the priority thing to do. You might as well clean it up. So there's no reason, there's no reasonable way of having reason to have a bad XML sitemap. So yes, you should do it, but it's not absolutely critical to do that. But that's like a lot of things in SEO. Not everything is critical. Yeah. It depends on everything, but there's just some best ways of doing things and not others, depending on the situation.
Well, I've seen people freaking out and thinking the sky is falling and everything, and it doesn't exist anymore. And just understand that what is in the sitemap is really kind of a guide to help Google index your pages, right? But Google can find your pages from any number of ways, right? The sitemap is just one of many, many ways that it's going to find your site and it's going to crawl it, right? So you, as you were saying, Simon, you could put a site up there. You could have no sitemap whatsoever. And eventually Google's going to find it and they're going to index it, right?
Yep.
I mean, you almost can't escape it. It's kind of creepy.
Yeah. It goes further than that as well, because any link to your site, it'll remember it for years. Years and years. I still get traffic through to my personal site when it was on movable type back in 2002. It's still, there's somewhere out there. There's a link to that site.
Yeah.
And I have a rather good plugin from someone not too far away from this conversation that I've just got in there, and I've just chucked it off to somewhere reasonable within the site. But yeah, they're not going to forget. They're not going to forget the URLs very easily, so you want to make sure they're right.
Yeah. So sitemaps are really useful for, as you mentioned, getting Google to recrawl when content changes, right? It's certainly as good for discovery. And, what I recommend to people is just, if you got a new site, upload the sitemap and just let Google go to town and index it. You'll be good to go. But the sitemaps are really useful when content changes on a regular basis. Maybe you got a blog that new entries come in with some kind of regularity. It can be a nice way to kind of tap Googlebot on the shoulder and say, hey, buddy, come over here, right? And the Googlebot has a crawl budget anytime it visits your page, and that is the amount of time that it's going to spend trying to index your pages. And it's a complete black box in terms of how Google allocates that, but it's based on your authority and importance and all that kind of stuff. But the long and the short of it is that the sitemap can tell Google, or can give it hints, I should say, in terms of how it should spend its time indexing your stuff, right? So I know some of the people at Moz were experimenting with, they don't have all of their blog pages listed in their sitemap at all. They just have like the most recent 10, right? So that when the sitemap is looked at, Googlebot has just got 10 things on its list to do, because the content that's been around there for a long time, it's already indexed, right? It's already there, you know? So they're trying to use the sitemap as a way to get Google to pay more attention to the new stuff that may or may not be indexed. Does that sound like a reasonable summary, or anything? You done any experiments like that at all, Simon?
Yes. That's a very reasonable way of saying it. I should go take that a little bit further. Robots text, you were probably going to come on to that next, weren't you? Yep. Robots text is really interesting because, like canonicals, it is a suggestion to Google what to do.
Right.
So this big tip from me for developers here: when you're developing a site on the dev environment, not production environment, and it's live so the customers can see it, don't use robots text to hide it, because you can put a disallow in there to stop it being indexed. But that doesn't mean that Google won't index the pages on that site if there is a link into it.
Mm-hmm.
It'll still do it. So you should really password protect it. And the amount of people that don't do the password protection is unbelievable. And the other downside of that is, as well, is that people will then push the site live, and the robots text has still got the disallow on there, which means sites still getting picked up unless there's links into those pages.
Right.
That's a very common mistake.
No, absolutely. And that's something that SEOmatic tries to help you out with.
Yeah.
So it has a concept of environments, and it's going to make sure that if it's a staging environment or a local dev environment, that not only is the robots.txt telling it not to index this stuff, but also on every page, it's going to have a meta robots tag that says no index. Right. But you're right. I see that a lot in terms of switching environments where people will screw up. And it's actually harder to get Google to forget stuff sometimes than it is to get it to index it the first time. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I never mess up. But if I did in the past, I've learned from that by creating I always have robots.txt be a craft template that just sniffs out the environment. So I don't have to forget and then try desperately to unindex dev URLs.
Yeah, and that's something that, again, SEOmatic does for you. Mm-hmm. But we'll get into that later, Matt. Matt, you and I we're gonna have a chat about that. But I think you raised a really, really important point, Simon, is that everything, if you ever talk about something that you're doing for Google, you're not telling Google anything. You're giving it a suggestion, right? Even things, okay, so with your sitemap, you're suggesting to Googlebot, please, Googlebot, if you would be so kind, can you pay attention to these things and index them, right? Whether Googlebot is going to listen to you or not, it's up to them. So it's really a suggestion. And there are even some other things that I think are kind of crazy. So a lot of people think that the SEO, so the title tag, and the description tag is exactly what Google is going to use on the search engine result page for your page, right? True or false, Simon?
Depends. It's false. And I've got actually a really, really good example of this that picked up this week. Now, my wife and I do the website for the small local florist in our village, which is lovely. That means my wife she's up there all the time spending all the money that the florist spends with us, and she goes back and spends it on flowers. But
yeah, that's not working.
No, it's not working at all. But we've done certain things with the site, and obviously we've got the meta description in there. And I noticed this week that we'd added an extra, because this Sunday's Mother's Day, so Mother's Day flowers are a big thing. It's the biggest part of the year for them. So we put some extra opening hours on the homepage, and Google's stopped using the meta description and actually used that bit of text from the homepage, right at the top of the homepage, as a description, because it's coming up to Mother's Day. And you got to sit back and applaud Google for doing that, because it's exactly what people want to see. So yes, it will choose whatever's relevant. But what people get their knickers in a twist about is that I've put that description, it should be using that, but it is actually dependent upon the intent of the person doing the search. Pages, it might be about a certain subject, etc., but you will have keywords in there which may bring traffic in looking for something else. And Google's trying to work out what the person doing the search is asking for.
Right.
And delivering up what it thinks is going to be the best thing. So whilst we do all this stuff with descriptions and everything, and description is different because to me that's a marketing tool for in the SERPs to get people to go through, it will choose whatever's best for whatever search has been done. That was it.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
I think that's been my favorite part about SEO that's been true since keyword stuffing and the darker, easy garbage a long time ago, is the emphasis is always just on, are you doing the right thing with your content? Are you trying to communicate the right message? Are you doing it in a way that's efficient for people with crappy internet and, different devices? Its heart is in the right place. And the minute you're making decisions specifically for SEO is when you're stepping out onto, maybe dicey territory.
Well, that's what I find absolutely hilarious, is that there are companies that they will hire SEO consultants that will spend an inordinate amount of time. Well, first of all, back in the day, it was keyword stuffing, right? Which these days, Google completely ignores your keywords field. Okay, just ignores it. So if you're working with an SEO consultant that is asking you about optimizing your keywords in the meta keywords field, run, okay? Because it does absolutely nothing for Google, which is one of the biggest search engines out there. And in fact, it can be a negative.
Yeah, it could actually be harm to use meta keywords, correct?
If it looks like you're doing it in a spammy way, Google can use that as one of the factors that it will figure out that, hey, this is a spam site, right? But then you'll also have SEO companies that are spending an inordinate amount of time trying to handcraft, just the perfect title tag for the page or the perfect description for the page. And yes, it's true that when that description is used on the SERP, that is a marketing thing that can be used to help induce clicks and that type of thing. But Google isn't necessarily going to pick it, right? If it thinks you did a bad job, or it thinks that your description is not relevant, or it thinks your title is not relevant, it's just not going to use it.
And it's relevant for that search.
Right. And that's why Google makes all the money, right? People go to Google and they want it to find what they're searching for, right? And that's how Google makes their money, is by figuring out what is this person looking for and how should we rank something. And that's why I really think that there is some folly in constantly trying to game the system in one way or the other. Now, granted, you can't game the system now the way you used to be able to game the system, but there still are certain things that SEO companies are trying to do that, to me, amount to gaming the system. Whereas, as Matt was saying, really you'd be better off just having good content, or other universal things that no matter how the algorithm is tweaked here or there, you're going to be doing well. And it will end up being that your content is something that people actually do want to find, right?
And a lot of that is part of brand building. So whatever company you've got, even if it's a mum and pop store or it's an international company, brand should be part of that. And you want to build that brand up. And that's not having thousands of thin pages with no content in, but you're using them as gateway pages to get the traffic in. That's not brand building. That's not a long proposition as far as a business goes.
Right.
It's quite different.
Or like mini sites, right? That all point to another site. That used to be a thing.
Yeah, that's more down to vanity of marketeers who've got a budget and they just want to go and build something and say, look what I've built. Yeah, they are disappearing.
But that's what I love. I love that the better Google gets at its job, the more these SEO firms that are doing dodgy or useless things just die, right? Because it just doesn't work anymore,
Yeah, they're going back to IRS scams, aren't they?
Well, yeah, I don't know where they're going. They're going somewhere. But this all stemmed from us talking about the sitemap. So have a good sitemap. It's fine. It's great. But don't freak out. It's if your sitemap is unavailable or you just don't have one or whatever, it's not like Google It's not like you don't exist. Okay. The sitemap is it's not the actual representation of your site on the internet. Google has all that. It's got all that already. Right. So don't freak out and don't get too overhyped about the sitemap. Now, if you do have high traffic site where content changes pretty often, and then, it's great to have a good sitemap that will point Google in the right direction when it comes to spending its crawl budget on your site. Because really the new content is the stuff that you want it to focus its time on, right?
There's also things you can do as a developer to help that as well. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure your site's running quickly, and there aren't loads of broken links, and the site isn't 1,000 pages deep. Right. The deeper the bits of sites are, the longer it's going to take for the crawlers to get down to those. The shallower the site is, it's more likely they'll find everything. So when you're planning out your structure, your architecture for the site, and how you get around the site as well, do some very obvious things. Don't use JavaScript for navigation. Just use links. That's what they're for. They're very, very good.
And this would probably be a good time to mention as well that if you're using one of those fancy new JavaScript frameworks that we all love, you really might want to consider pre-rendering or server-side rendering these things. And the reason is that Googlebot, when it encounters pages, it will try to index them immediately. But if there's JavaScript that needs to be executed to render that page, those get pushed into a different pile that get deferred and indexed later. How much later? They can't tell you. And just from a reliability point of view and from a speed point of view, I just really think that it makes sense to be, from an SEO perspective and also from a performance perspective, it makes sense to server-side pre-render this stuff.
Try and help that search engine crawl through your site as quickly as possible. And it renders in a mobile version of Chrome these days. So that is very important as well when you develop your site. Make sure that it is crawlable within mobile.
Yeah, and everyone who is listening to this podcast, I want you to go ahead and go to About Chrome and take a look at the version of Chrome that you're running right now. So, for instance, I'm running Chrome 73, right? Googlebot runs Chrome 41. Okay? That's what you're dealing with in terms of the rendering engine and its ability to parse JavaScript and all that stuff. But what I love about what you're saying, Simon, is that the better you make the site for humans, the better you make it for Google to index it, which makes complete sense, right? Yep. Because if Google is trying to return what it thinks the person wants, obviously the site would have to be good for people, right? So make it fast, make it accessible. The more accessible your page is, the easier time not only people will have parsing it and looking through it, and people with handicaps or disabilities or whatever, they'll have an easier time checking out your site. But on top of that, that also makes it easier for Google to crawl it, right?
Exactly. One of the things I've been saying for years about SEO and accessibility is that the biggest user of your or visitor to your websites is blind. It's good.
100%. Say that again, because that was so good. Say it again.
The biggest visitor to your site is blind, and it's Google. That's actually not true anymore because they do render pages, but that's what I've been saying that for years, and it really makes people think you do want to have an accessible site. And I see a lot of businesses, especially in the past, going, well, we don't need we don't want to spend the extra money for an accessible site unless we need to do it for compliance reasons. And it's like, oh, I'm not going to, and then developers as well. It's like, making a site accessible is a big step forward, and it's like, well, that's going to cost a lot more, and business pull back from that. But for me as an SEO, I'm going, please make your site accessible, because it just makes it better for SEO, and you don't have to spend tons on SEO to get it right. You've already made the site crawlable and usable by humans in whatever position, whether they're disabled or temporarily disabled. If they've, I don't know, whatever reasons, people aren't blind when they're looking at the site, the lights might be dim. You're not blind. You've just got low light in your room. It's just like that.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that you're saying. And I love the fact that the best practices of performance, of writing compliant HTML, of writing accessible stuff, I love how this all ties together, and it ends up making your site better for SEO as well. And this is why I'm tempted to say that modern SEO is technical SEO, because you get all those things right.
Yes.
And assuming you got decent content, I mean, man, you're going to do good, right?
So, but there's on-page and off-page SEO, and it's the on-page stuff that you would potentially say is technical, but not really, because the content part, the words and the images, really aren't technical SEO. They're on page, but I wouldn't say they were technical. I'd say creative writing. So yeah, but that's just nuances on words, semantics.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I shouldn't say that is everything. So technical SEO, I guess I would add to that you also want to have a good content strategy that creates good content that's well organized.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
What I tell clients, for some clients, I monitor site health, and I just consider SEO to be a part of that. And what we monitor is an SEO performance as much as health, like just making sure that pages have content that's well indexed and that appeases the Google when it decides to show up. And what I tell people is that the sites that I build are 80%, doing 80% of the way to getting it to, a great place for SEO. If we hit that other 20%, which is you have a product that's named similarly to something that it competes with, or you're thinking about changing domains 4 times, or you have 12 different sites and you're doing something very specific, that's what I just think of as a 20%, where we'll refer to a specialist that it's not on-page stuff necessarily, but strategy that could impact the bottom line a lot that you don't want me giving you answers for. Like, it's highly specialized stuff that I'll refer people to. But I think SEO is basically just a component of site health as much as speed or, legibility or a bunch of other different things that needs to be maintained and managed and gauged and kept up, but isn't, non-technical or usually more complicated than that.
I agree with that as well. It's a quality issue. Yeah. Making sure your site retains that quality from when it was last redesigned and relaunched. If you've got a site that's being updated on a regular basis by somebody using a content management system, it's likely that there are little things going to creep in that's going to lower that quality. Maybe they've written an article which isn't particularly brilliant. It's just 400 words instead of 800, or maybe 200 words instead of 500 or something like that.
Right.
So thin content, you can identify those things by doing a regular audit, depending on how big the site is and how often it changes. You'd want to have a regular audit, either yearly, quarterly, weekly, even for some, just to make sure that quality is kept up from an SEO point of view, but also that's slots straight into a marketing point of view as well. Why would you want to have out-of-date content on your site? You've got to have a strategy for that as well. So somebody needs to be going through that cycle, making sure that the site's up to scratch and it's up to date.
Yeah, and performance is twofold, right? So one thing is that Google will rank your site higher if it loads quicker, because people want a site that loads quick, right? Again, it's trying to return not just the search result, but a thing that people want. And Google has decided people want something quick, which I think is very true, especially on mobile. But then performance also matters from the point of view of, if Googlebot has a budget, which is based in time, the faster your pages load, the more of them it's going to be able to index, right? So this is where you want to have a site that performs well and hits all of these, and as you were saying, you want it to be accessible so that the Googlebot is able to crawl it and understand it. You want it to be using semantic HTML so that Google can have a better sense of exactly where things are on the page, which, oh, by the way, happens to be really good from an accessibility point of view. And all of these things run together to where it's kind of like, do a good job, right? And you're probably halfway home, right?
Yeah, with content as well, something which I'm really keen on is that semantic markup for that content needs to be right there. So you've got a H1 title for the page saying what the page is, and then the rest of the content needs to be split up into proper headings with the proper structure of H2s and H3s and possibly H4s if you need them as well, but and proper lists, etc. That semantic structure, that content, is incredibly important to Google. That's why you will rank higher if it's done like that. If you've got headings which are images, an extreme example, it's not going to see them as headings, so it won't understand the context of how that content fits together, and you're not likely to do so well answering a question that's asked.
Yeah, and all of these things that we're doing to try to help Googlebot understand things better. So the semantic HTML, the writing things that are correct. I mean, this is all helping Googlebot digest it better. Also useful to people with accessibility issues in terms of accessing our site. But really, I mean, what we're trying to do is we're trying to help Googlebot understand the page, which leads me to structured data, right? So Google, it's still, I mean, it's pretty good about understanding things, but one of the things that machines are bad about and people are good about is understanding context. And that's where structured data comes in, right, Simon?
Yeah, very much. And it's a hot subject at the moment, and I think structured data is more important than it's ever been before. I've started the last couple of years, started using it and seen some very good results from it.
Yep.
It can be quite tricky to understand how to put it together, and there aren't many tools out there that help, to be honest. At the moment, Google Search Console has just brought in the ability in the new one to check your structured data, and there is a Google structured data tool as well, but they don't match. So you can put the same code in page in both, and it will give you different answers to it. Meanwhile, Screaming Frog, a rather neat crawler for SEO people, has, in the last couple of weeks, added a function to it where you can also verify your structured data while you're crawling the site as well, which is incredibly handy. But yeah, I've over the last couple of years, I've spent hours trying to get structured data right. It's tricky. I'm not a JavaScript writer, so it may come easier to JavaScript people, but when it works really, really well. And back to my florist example, very good example on that. My florist does workshops, and we've set them up as events on the page. So when we go into the content management system at the back end of that, we add the dates in, etc., and I get it to write out all that to JSON LD scripts within the page. And Google is now showing the next 3 workshops in the SERP rankings, and that does so much better than her competitors in the local area. It looks great.
Yeah. Well, and this is something that I have been an advocate for structured data for a long time. So structured data has been around in one form or another for a long time. And I think it makes sense for us to kind of back up and explain what it is. So if we just gave Google a page to look at, it can do its best to kind of try to figure out what's going on there and what the relationship between things are and that type of thing, but it may not always get it right. Right. So structured data is kind of a way that we can tell it, hey, this is what this thing is. Right. And back in the day, you use something called microdata that you actually put inline in your HTML, where you do something like div item scope item type equals, right? And then you'd have like span.
Not a nice thing, Andrew.
I know, right? Span item prop equals, video format or whatever it happens to be, right? And this was kind of terrible because you had to intertwine it with the actual HTML code. And then what you're talking about, Simon, is JSON LD, which is in a way what caused me to write SEO-matic to begin with, is I wanted that kind of support in there. And that's something that I know you're using it, Simon. It should help you out because it has every single schema.org is an actual model that you can just create in there, and you can kind of do whatever you want with. But the thing that I think I've seen a lot of people get hung up on is they try to do, well, okay, so either people do absolutely nothing with structured data or they try to do too much. Right. And when I say try to do too much, I mean, someone will come to me and they'll say, hey, I'm trying to implement this particular like medical institution structured data. And I would say to them, why? Like, what are you trying to accomplish? And the reason I say that is that Google only consumes a very limited subset of the schema.org vocabulary. And we'll put a link in the show notes to the things that it can actually look at. But there's just certain things where, I don't know, like, why waste your time putting it on there if nothing's going to be consuming it? Do you think I've got it wrong and we should put everything on there and just wait for it to eventually consume it, Simon?
2 minds about that. I think whatever Google says we should do, a lot of people do say, well, they're saying do this, but a year later and still nothing's happened. But eventually, everything that Google's said has come to pass. So I tend to follow what they do and implement it, and maybe several years later that stuff matters. With schema and JSON LD, I kind of do put stuff in which Google can't yet or doesn't take any notice of at the moment. The downside of that is they are still changing it quite a bit. So, you might have to go back and revisit it. But I think if you've got content there, I don't think there's anything wrong with adding structured data in which isn't used at the moment. It may be used later. So if you're doing it programmatically within the CMS, you might as well do it because it's probably not going to take you very long to put it together.
As long as it doesn't take you very long. I agree. But I think that what you should probably focus on at your core is hitting some of the really, really nice things that you can implement in there. Like if you have products, of course you should put in there. If you have reviews and breadcrumbs and corporate contact numbers and all that kind of lovely stuff, definitely you should be paying attention to structured data because this is your way to help Google get it right. So when it visits your page and it tries to index and digest it and understand it, instead of it guessing, you can give it hints to help it get it correct in terms of the classification. And then there are also certain things where if the right JSON LD is there, in the search engine results page, you'll get some really nice, they used to call them rich snippets. I don't even know what they're calling them now. Do you know, Simon? They changed it.
It changes so much. Everything's featured snippets now, I think. That's what I... Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, they were rich pins and rich snippets, and they change the name all the time. But basically the stuff that's displayed on the search engine results page, if you have, for instance, recipe JSON LD, you can end up with some really, really nice search engine results with like, the recipe and the ingredients list for your apple pie listed in there and all that kind of cool stuff. So from that perspective, I think structured data is something that everyone should be paying attention to because you get some amazing gains out of it, right?
There is a slight downside to it as well. If you're competing around or you're getting traffic in for certain search phrases and there is no featured snippet, and then you go and put structured data in and it causes a featured snippet to be put in there, your organic, hopefully your number one organic, that drops down the page and people may not click through. So there is a situation where if you're, say, 8 or 9 down the page and you're finding it difficult or the ones above you have got far better content, etc., you might just want to concentrate on that featured snippet and get yourself up to the top of the page. But there's no guarantee that people will click through anyway. So it's a hard line to sweat. I'd say do it anyway. Yes, you might lose some a little bit of traffic, but I think there are some big sites that do get worried about that. But I think just go to it anyway.
Why does that cause you to drop inherently? Is there a reason, or do we just have to accept that that's
because these feature snippets, people don't tend to click through on them as much because you're getting the information you want there. So it could be there are ways around this. So for example, if you want to know how to staple paper, what the perfect angles. If you go and search the perfect angle to staple paper, you may find that I actually own that featured snippet, or did last time I looked, and it's one of my experiments.
He's not even kidding. He actually owns that.
That's incredible. I never even thought about it. Really.
But one of the things to do in there is that Google will show 4 or 5 items in a list on how to do something. So you make sure your list on the page has got more, so 6, 7, or 8 points, because then in the feature snippet, it'll have the first 4 or 5, and then it'll have a more button underneath, which will then take that user through to your website, which is what you want. If you've only got, say, sort something out on your Outlook mail or something, and it's got do this, and do this, but there's nothing more, then people don't need to go through to your website.
Right. Does that make sense, Matt?
Mm-hmm. And the other item as well is the image that goes with that feature snippet might not come from your website. So you need to make sure you've got an image and it's got the proper captions and alt text in there as well.
Right. Yeah. You want to fill out all of that stuff. So, Marion, you've been listening to us yammer on about SEO for a little bit. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I'm trying to figure out what they are. My questions, I guess, are about sites that get very little traffic. Not that anybody would necessarily want to bother, but if you have one of those sites that gets tens of hits a month, how do the SEO best practices vary? I suppose it's pretty much the same. You want to have decent content and reasonable, reasonably fast loading and so on.
Well, if it's a super low traffic site, you're probably not going to be hiring an SEO consultant to do anything with it, right?
You're probably not even paying for SEO-matic, truth be told.
Right. So just make a site that's well made, and make it accessible, make it fast, make sure it has all the technical things implemented. And, I mean, that's good enough.
Decent content that changes once in a while.
Yeah, for sure. But if it's a very narrow interest, I don't know. I mean, Simon, do you have any thoughts on this?
Not really. I do get approached by a lot of people, small businesses especially, who are in exactly that position. They can't afford a lot. But yeah, so good content will bring traffic. And the question is, where do you put your money? So if you've got a shoe repair shop up the road, it might be better, rather than building a website for several £1,000s, to actually put some signage up or advertise in the local newspaper, etc. You've got to work out what the best strategy is.
And where your morality lies, because you can just, start writing headlines like, staple paper better with this one cool trick and maybe generate more interest, but at the expense of...
I'll be honest with you, Matt. Like, Simon has kind of waved the red flag in front of the bull. Like, I want to beat him.
I think you should. I think you should call people up, cold call people, and say that that they are stapling their paper wrong, and and if they will give you your credit card number, you will be able to fix that for them, because otherwise terrible things will happen.
That's right.
I mean, I've already got like the top 5 headlines picked out that I'm going to use to try and unseat you, Simon.
Well, best of luck. It's going to take you a while, because that story I actually wrote in 2004, I think. It's been around for a long time, so Google knows about it. And it was all on Metafilter as well, back in 2004. So it's got a lot of backlinks to it.
Well, step one in our siege is to do a continuous denial of service attack on your site.
It's on Cloudflare, the site, so that's not going to work.
All right. Step 1 is to hack into your site. Bring it down.
Good, better content. Look at my content, read it, write it better. Don't just spin it, write better content. And step 2 is to add a video of stapling, because I haven't done that yet, and somebody else has. Right? A video thing, and I need to sort that out.
That's right. I can get the video snippet.
Yeah.
Oh, you'd be in big trouble. You'd be in big trouble. Well, and this has been really interesting, and I hope this has been a useful talk to people that are web developers. Kind of a little insight into the SEO world. Do you have anything that you would want to add to this, Simon?
Really, just love your technical SEO person, because they really are on your side, and there's some really good technical SEOs around, and they've got a foot in both camps, both in SEO and technical. I know quite a few who do go out and they do build websites. So like me, they understand what's going on, and that really helps when it comes to the bigger sites, etc., and what they're doing. There is a lot of shysters out there, so it's a case of you start talking to an SEO, you will understand. If they're talking your language, you'll understand that they know what you're talking about. So that's the people to choose. That's the people to work with. Yeah,
and this is getting back to what we're talking about in the beginning, but I've had times where I've worked on sites with Jonathan Melville quite a bit, and he's told me about this client has got this SEO company involved, and I'm like, I feel that you have a moral responsibility to talk to your client and to say, look, you're wasting your money on the stuff that they're asking you to do. Do you think that would you feel that you have that responsibility, Simon?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things key for me when I go and do an audit of a site is I need to put everything into priority, and I need to talk to the developers and the business to understand what they think their priorities should be as well. If they've got an endless coffer of money, then great, I'll put it in the priority that I think they should do it in. But I really do need to understand the business. There's going to be things you need to fix this immediately, and then long-term things like it would be better if you added some more text onto this page because it's a bit thin or something like that.
But how do you argue that then, right? So let's say that you're in a position where a good-sized company has hired you to build their site for them, but they have a long-term SEO company that they're partners for, and that long-term SEO company is let's say they're getting high 4 figures every month from this business. Right. And you, as someone who are skilled in this area, look at what this company is doing and you realize that your client is getting ripped off. Right. Yeah. How do you broach that conversation?
I'd be straight there and saying, are you covering that cost? What's your return on the cost of this? What they're doing here, because it's going to be fairly obvious when you start looking at what they're doing, and if they're paying that much a month, what are they actually doing to the site? And if it's just ticky-tacky stuff, just changing headlines and stuff every now and again, you say, well, you're not really getting your money's worth from that. And the business will know. Either they're just wasting money, in which case I might come up with some schemes of my own and tap in there myself, or it's really a case of you're just changing headlines. What's the bottom line on that? Let's have a look at your analytics and see if your traffic's gone up because of that. Now,
but that's the problem. I think they don't know, right? The businesses don't know, so they're just relying on the SEO people, and they think, well, if I don't do this, my SEO will be worse and no one's going to visit my site.
And the other problem as well is that SEO does take a long time. You're not going to see immediate gains. It's a bit by bit process where you do have to do these little things. But you can stand back and say, okay, what is this compared with? What are the stats like compared with last year?
Right.
Are we doing better? And can you attribute that to the work the SEO company has done? But if it's just changing headlines and stuff, then
well, I'm going to exaggerate it and say it's something completely obvious. So let's say, Simon, one of the things that they ask you to do is to go in and to change the SEO keywords on every page, right? So the actual meta name equals keywords tag, which is ignored and can even be detrimental.
Well,
and they're asking you to do that, and that they're billing the company a bunch of money where they run tools to analyze each page, and they look at the searches, and they are coming up with this optimized set of keywords that they want you to put in there. So it's something that is just wasting money.
The first thing I'd be going to the business is your target market, are they all searching through Bing? Because Bing still does use keywords.
True.
And one or two other search engines does. But very likely, we look at their stats and look at their analytics, and you're going to see probably less than 5% from Bing. And you can go, well, that's not your market. And all they're doing is addressing 5% of your potential market.
Mm-hmm.
Boom, there's your stats. As an SEO, the two things I want immediately are access to Google Analytics and Google Search Console. And that gives you a really good insight into what's going on. And devs should have that as well. They need to know what's going on as well. So with that lot, you can have a really good overview of what's going on and see what an agency's been doing, if it's improved.
But then how do you have that conversation where in the pyramid, you're kind of at the bottom, or you somehow ended up there where you're getting instructions from the SEO company to then do this stuff? How do you then broach that conversation with the client and be like, look, these guys, I think they're wasting your money?
Well, I'll shift that slightly and say for many years I worked in in-house in a large financial global corporation, and the business would trust external agencies who would come in and say exactly this sort of stuff. And I'd be sitting there going, but that doesn't make sense. That's a waste of money. You spent 180 grand on an audit. We could have done that for 500 quid.
Oh my God, I see that so often. Sorry, go ahead.
And the problem is you've got middle management there who don't want to admit they've made a mistake. Perhaps their boss has said, use this company for whatever reasons. And, well, it's a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
But you've got to talk about budget and say, well, do you want to spend this again next year? Or do you would like to have better performance site for less money?
Yeah. And my preference would be just to be brutally honest with the client and be like, look, you can do whatever you want. This is your site, but I think you're wasting your money. And then here is why. And then just let it go from there.
Yeah.
Whereas I think some other people might be less inclined to rock the boat, shall we say,
Absolutely.
I think I'm with Matt, that the important thing is not so much to get people to agree with you, but to get people to listen to you.
Agreed. Yeah.
And then, you have to turn around and listen to them too, because I can imagine that you might, those people might feel like, well, if I do this inexpensive thing and it doesn't, the SEO is not improved fantastically, then on the one hand, I haven't spent a lot of money, but on the other hand, it hasn't improved fantastically. But if I spend a lot of money, then at least my ass is covered that I have done the thing. And that may be the rational thing for them to do.
And if you have their trust and both of you have the good of the company in mind, or whatever the pursuit is, then if it comes down to politics and they're willing to share that, then you can work together to figure out how to make it the key person's idea to do better, organic SEO instead of wasting loads of money on AdWords or whatever the thing might be. And just sell it politically, or you can still help them with that. But I think if you don't have trust, then there's no way you're going to have that conversation.
Well, let me give you a concrete example. And I would love to have Simon or anyone else chime in on this. So I was working on a long-term contract with a client, and one of the things that I had done for them was created some fantastic JSON LD for them. I mean, it was very nicely done. Okay. You're just going to have to take my word for that. Then they hired an SEO agency to come in, and they were trying to, tweak this, improve that, improve the other thing. And one of the things that they wanted to do, Simon, was they wanted to change some of the things that were JSON LD. They wanted to change it to be microdata. So basically the same thing. It's conveying the same structured data information, but they wanted to change the schema that was used from JSON LD, which is more modern, which is something that Google has said that they're using going forward, to something that was very dated in terms of, yes, it still is consumable, but what's the point, right? So why am I doing this? So, one of the things I said to the client was,
can I interject?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Why did they want to do this?
I'm okay. I'm going to get there because I asked that question.
Okay.
All right. So of course I asked that question, Matt. You know me. Sure. Of course I asked that. Right. So first of all, Simon, what do you think of this situation? And I'm going to continue to elaborate on it.
It's a little bit surprising, but there may be reason behind it. The way I would have approached it, I'd have gone, okay, this is interesting. We're going away from microdata because it's hard to maintain, etc., and obviously JSON. But let's have an experiment. Let's change one page and have another page which is very similar to similar sort of traffic on it, etc., similar sort of organic reach. So you pick a couple of pages and just monitor them for several months and see what happens.
Right.
And if that microdata does improve it, you've got the data there. You can say, okay, yeah, let's scroll it around the rest of the site. If it drops dramatically, it probably wouldn't.
Right.
It'll probably stay the same because
exactly
still okay. It's just like, if it stays the same, then you go back to the business person and you say, well, we've spent this amount of resource doing this, and to do it across the rest of the site, it's going to cost X amount, and it doesn't actually bring you any benefits at all.
Right. Yeah. So I did very similar things to what you and Matt said initially, which is I said, JSON LD is the preferred modern format that Google is recommending that everybody use. Microdata is this old format. I mean, yes, it will work, but why are we doing this? Like, what's the gain in going in and changing this, right? And it ends up being that the gain is that this SEO company didn't know anything about JSON LD, right? Whatever tool they were using to run the tests on the site. And I don't know if it was a custom internal tool or if it was a tool provided by somebody else. That tool did not understand JSON LD, right? So when they ran that tool on their site, it came up that it didn't have this certain JSON LD there, right? And I'm looking at this and I'm just like, you got to be kidding me. Like, these guys have no idea what they're talking about. They're being paid tons of money to make this recommendation. And in the end, their answer they came back was, well, the times that we'd used it before, this microdata worked. So why don't you go do it? Okay. I'm just like, are you kidding me? So the reason why you're recommending this is the automated tool that you're running on the site is so outdated that it doesn't even consume JSON LD. And the justification you're going to give me is that it's worked for you in the past. And this is the kind of thing that just drives me crazy because it takes me from the, SEO is a science, is measurable, into the sacrificing chickens and drawing pentagrams. You know what I mean? Like, why are we using this? Oh, because it's worked before. Oh, okay.
The further back into the past you go, the better it'll work. Get far enough back and they're right. The JSON LD will be completely meaningless.
But this was at a big company, right? That was being charged. That was being charged lots of money by these people that were doing consulting. And I'm over here going, guys, what are you doing? Yeah.
So did they listen to you?
Of course not. No. So in the end, what ended up happening was, and Simon, you're right. Like, an experiment would have been interesting, but it ended up just being one page that this was going to be changed on anyway for this one particular thing. And so, under numerous very polite protests, I said, fine, okay, I'll do what they want us to do. So we did it, and absolutely nothing changed. And we wasted a bunch of time and money. And that's all,
Gross.
But their tool could then read it.
Oh, well, that's wonderful.
Well, we don't know what else was going on behind that. I can think of a similar situation where we spent, back in the big finance company, we spent a year talking to an advertising agency, trying to get them to build some system so that we could get the data from the adverts they were putting out on the web back into our own analytics. But in the end, they refuse. Every step of the way, they refuse to do it. And it's simply because, two things. It would have cost them a lot of money, and it would have given them no benefit, although it would have given us a huge amount of benefit. And the biggest part of that benefit was that we could actually see what was going on with the adverts, as opposed to reading their report and them telling us what had gone on with the adverts. And I think they were bleeding the company dry, and they were just making the figures up. And that happens a lot.
I know. And I think that's what was happening here. And that's what was driving me crazy. And this is one of this is one of many, many situations that I've been into. And I'm just like, I can't even deal with it. You know what I mean? Like, it drives me nuts. Like, what are you doing? You're leeching money off of this company, and you're asking them to do. I mean, the real problem is they didn't have anyone at the company that understood this stuff and could then call BS on it, right? So the only one who was kind of calling BS on it was me, and I'm just the contractor. You know what I mean? So I think really it's kind of a failing of that company that they don't have anyone in that position. But that's why you hire contractors a lot, is when you don't have a skill set in your company. And you need some outside expertise to help you out. And it just drives me crazy that so many SEO companies they're kind of preying on that, you know?
But you've also got this, with any agency, you've got layers of management in them, and you've got your studio floor with your creatives and your developers, and the people who really know what's going on. Then you've got an account team, and the account team know how to sell stuff to the business and keep the business happy, but they don't know what the creative and the development teams know. So you're going to get that dispass between the two. You really, in those situations, the agency does need to bring a team together with the right people in it. Even if the developers and creatives aren't particularly good with the clients, they need to be there for situations like this.
But, I've got tons of war stories like this, and this is where, when I express some of these opinions about SEO and SEO companies, like this is the kind of thing, like this is where it's coming from. You know what I mean?
But on the other hand, there's a lot of business out there still till the next recession. So I mean, if at the end of the day, it's not your family, it's just business. Right. And at the end of the day, if they're going to do that, it's go and find another client.
No, I agree, but it makes me sad.
It's frustrating, yeah.
They are creating an opportunity for you to be honest and establish a different kind of rapport, though. One of the things I like is I work with a lot of clients that I'm often like not the first person they've hired and just saying, don't take my word for anything. Right. Like, if something doesn't make sense, don't just nod because I say this is a good idea. Like, question it. And if it doesn't stand up to scrutiny, it's probably not a great idea.
Yeah. And I would love to question Matt on why he is not using my SEO-matic plugin, but that about wraps it up for another episode of the devmode.fm podcast. To have every episode delivered to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to our RSS or subscribe via iTunes or Google Play. And if you like what we're doing, leave us a review. You can also follow us on Twitter at devmodefm, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Leave us a comment on the devmode.fm website. For the devmode.fm podcast, I'm Andrew Welch.
I'm Marian Newlevant.
And I'm Matt Stein.
And thank you very much for coming on, Simon. I appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure.
Stapling paper in the background, could you?
I got to admit it, this podcast was all just an excuse for me to have a cathartic release.
I think you should find